Today's guest speaker is Dr. Kristin Seaborg, who is a pediatrician at Group Health Cooperative. An advocate for epilepsy awareness, Kristin hopes that writing and speaking about epilepsy will help decrease the stigma associated with seizures. By sharing her own story, Kristin wants to increase our awareness and understanding of those who live with seizures. She will also share some insights inside her book, The Sacred Disease, My Life with Epilepsy. I also want to mention that Kristin is surrounded by Rotarians in her life. She is the granddaughter of a Rotarian, the daughter of a Rotarian, the wife of a Rotarian, and I'm thinking soon to be a Rotarian. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. Her husband, Andrew, by the way, is a former Rotary Youth Exchange student and led a group study exchange team to Japan in 2003 before becoming a member of Madison West Rotary Club. We look forward to Kristin's presentation, and we have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way to say thank you for speaking to us today. As we welcome Dr. Seaborg to the podium, I want to remind you that if time permits, we will have microphones out in the audience, but we ask that you please wait for one to come to you before you make your question, ask your question. So at this time, let's please welcome Dr. Seaborg to the podium.
Two things down here. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. Can you guys do me a favor and pretend like you didn't hear any of that? And actually pretend like you can't read this slide, because I want to try a little thought experiment and see if you're as surprised as I am. So what if I was here to talk to you today about a mystery illness that affected 1 in 26 people, which is multiple people in this room? What if this mystery illness affected 50 million people worldwide, greater than 100,000 soldiers coming from Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts? What if this mystery illness led to 200,000 new diagnoses each year and led to up to 1/3 of all sudden death in children? What if this mystery illness caused 50,000 deaths per year, which is incidentally more than breast cancer? What if this mystery illness led to $15.5 billion in indirect costs per year, which is 7 times higher than any other chronic disease, 7 times higher than diabetes, than heart disease? So we should be really worried about this, right? This should be epidemic. We should be talking about it more and more. Do you guys think I'm here to talk about cancer, maybe? Cancer is really, we're all worried about cancer. Maybe this is a talk about heart disease. We hear a lot about heart disease. Or stroke. We all get worried about stroke as we age. I've been watching the news. Maybe this is about Zika virus. I was going to put that maybe I'm talking about election-related anxiety, but took that off. So you guys read the first slide. You're smart people. The illness I'm talking about is epilepsy. So you guys might have heard a lot about some of the common neurologic disorders in the United States. We hear a lot about Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy. But the thing is, if you see Parkinson's disease, MS, multiple muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, and epilepsy are grossly different in their actual incidence in the United States. This is based on 2013 population statistics, which is the most recent ones I could find. In fact, if we take it differently and we line them up, this is the incidence of muscular dystrophy in the US, plus the incidence of multiple sclerosis, plus the incidence of cerebral palsy, plus the incidence of Parkinson's disease. That's epilepsy. Epilepsy affects 5.1 million in the US, and all of these common neurologic disorders affect 2.2 million in the US. Interestingly, Alzheimer's is estimated to affect about 5.1 million in the US as well. So this is incredibly common. Why don't we talk about it? The NIH funding for epilepsy, unfortunately, is also much less than you might expect. I just told you that epilepsy is 2 times more common than all of these common neurologic disorders, but the funding is actually only 1/4 of that received for all of the common neurologic disorders. So the National Institute of Health in 2015 gave $138 million to fund epilepsy research and much, much less for many of the other things. So something has to change. So why don't we talk about it? I have a lot of theories, but one of my thoughts is that I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding about seizures, and there's still, unfortunately, a fair amount of stigma that is associated with epilepsy. I had the kind of fortune of talking to my son's confirmation retreat about a year ago. Stacy was there. And I asked a room of 6th and 7th graders, what do you think of when you hear somebody has epilepsy? And predictably so, a couple kids raised their hand, and some said, oh, I think of a person on the ground who's writhing and shaking and can't respond. Another kid said, oh, I think of somebody that's in a wheelchair that can't really talk to me. And while they were correct, they didn't know the whole picture. They didn't know the whole story. What we're finding in the years of research is that epilepsy is kind of like autism. It's a spectrum of disorders. There are people on one end of the spectrum who are profoundly affected, and there are people on the other end of the spectrum who are luckily, like me, able to lead a life, have a husband, have a normal job and a family. And there's a variety of things in between. So this misunderstanding, I think, is something that we have to clear up and improve over the years. But unfortunately, seizures, and the history about seizures and stigma goes back to prehistoric times. This is a picture of an ancient Babylonian tablet, which of course we can't read. But when they deciphered this, they found that the ancient Babylonians in 2000 BC described every single seizure type consistent with what we know that exists today. They also went on to write that every different seizure type was associated with a different evil spirit or god. And they considered seizures a divine punishment for sinners. Moving forward in time, in 400 BC, Hippocrates coined this term seleniatizae to describe people with epilepsy because he thought they were affected by the moon god, Selene. Interestingly, this is the early derivation of the term lunatic, which now we use in a very derogatory sense to describe people with mental illness. Hippocrates, though he had some interesting ideas, was ahead of his time. He was one of the first people that suggested that epilepsy had actually a physiologic origin and that it wasn't a punishment for sinners or a curse from the gods. He published a book called On the Sacred Disease, which is where I got the title for my book. And he wrote in his book about how epilepsy was because there was something going on in the brain of the person's body, as opposed to being something that was delivered from evil spirits. He actually also talked about and recommended early epilepsy surgery. Thank God I wasn't alive then. With these kind of weird rudimentary tools, his idea was to punch a hole in the opposite side of the brain affected to let out the extra phlegm. So things have clearly evolved since then. Moving forward in time, though, you might think that all the stigma's prehistory. In 1494, two Dominican friars wrote a handbook called the Malleus Maleficarum. You guys probably have heard of this, more commonly known as the witch hunting manual. And in the witch hunting manual, they stated that the way to identify a woman who was a witch was to identify her seizures. So subsequently, many people in the 15th century were killed because of their epilepsy. And again, you might be thinking that's prehistory, things have changed, but the stigma moves forward in time and still remains. In Nazi Germany in the 1920s, sterilization surgeries were recommended and performed on patients with epilepsy to ensure that they didn't reproduce. In 1956, as recently as 50 years ago in the US, patients with epilepsy were forbidden to marry in 17 states. I think the stigma associated with epilepsy is really kind of well brought together in this quote by Dr. Eugene Billard, who was a German psychiatrist in 1882. And I'm just going to read this to you so you can kind of understand and take it in. The epileptic is to be avoided. On all faces, he reads his sentence to isolation. Everywhere he goes, menacing and insurmountable obstacles arise to his obtaining a position, to establishing himself, to his relationships, and to his very livelihood. He has to say goodbye to his dreams of success, for the masters even refuse him to work in their shops. Goodbye to his dreams of marriage and fatherhood. Goodbye to the joys of the domestic hearth. This is death to the spirit. So why do I care? Why is this something that I feel so passionate about? That's my dad, the Rotarian. I had to put that in when I talked at his club. So my story begins in the spring of 1976 when I was 18 months old. Interestingly, it was the last time H1N1 influenza was pandemic or particularly prevalent in the US. So I caught a really bad case of influenza. And as my temperature rose, my body succumbed to my first and most devastating seizure. While seizures with fever often last for about 5 minutes and then they're over, mine went on for 45 minutes or more. And doctors think that prolonged seizure, during that time, the blood flow to the deepest parts of my brain slowed and then eventually stopped, causing a scar that would remain for the rest of my life. I was eventually placed in a medically induced coma to stop that seizure and remained in the Children's Hospital ICU for 2 weeks. First for a week on a ventilator treating the influenza, then for a week to monitor me after the seizure. When I was discharged from the hospital, my mom tells me that I was running around the room pointing out every baby and every new patient and every doctor, and it seemed like nothing had happened. But the doctor on the way out of the ICU grabbed my mom and he warned her, "This probably isn't the end of Kristin's seizures." Because that first event had been so severe, they placed me on the anti-epileptic medication phenobarbital, which I took every day till I was 5. Well, most people hate taking medications. I actually kind of thought it was fun. My parents would hide the medicine in a little dollop of ice cream or a spoonful of pudding, and they'd give me my treat every day after dinner. I took the medicine every day till I was 5, and finally had an EEG, or a test of my brain waves, which was normal. So the neurologist took me off the medication. My parents and I tucked epilepsy away in that kind of blanket or casket of things you really don't want to ever think about again. I had a really blissful childhood in Brookfield, Wisconsin. The things I had to worry about was whether or not I had enough Aquanet hairspray or fluorescent clothes to wear to school. But when I was 14, things changed again. I was at Great America, an amusement park near here, walking from one ride to another, when all of a sudden I was stopped dead in my tracks. I had this really, really weird sense of deja vu. It was like everything I was looking at I had dreamt the night before. And that was followed by this kind of feeling of butterflies in my stomach, like I was nervous. Then I got really, really hot. And then I was swallowing repeatedly. My friend, who was ahead of me, looked around and she said, "Kristin, are you coming? And what's that thing you're doing with your face?" But after the event came, it subsided as quickly as it came. And 30 seconds later, I caught up with my friends, and we continued with our day. I tried to explain to my parents that night what had happened at the amusement park. I was really at a loss for words. I couldn't describe all the different sensations I had felt. But they did what any good parent would do. They made an appointment with my pediatrician. I remember sitting in the pediatrician's office the next day, trying again to put to words what had happened the day before. So as I described kind of feeling hot and feeling nervous and my stomach was bothering me, he kind of latched onto the one thing that made sense to him. He said, "Oh, your stomach was bothering you." So he pulled me up on the exam table, lifted up my shirt as high as it could go, did an abdominal exam, then turned me over and did a rectal exam and took a stool sample, all with Dad sitting right there. So after that, he diagnosed me with reflux and told me to take 2 teaspoons of Mylanta if these episodes should ever happen again. And I had many, many, many more of those same episodes. But as you can probably imagine, as a 14-year-old girl, anything that's going to lead to partial disrobement and a rectal exam is going to be swept quickly under the carpet. So even though I had more episodes, like 10 to 12 a day at times, I didn't talk about them to anyone. I learned that if I felt this sensation of deja vu, if I kind of put my head in my locker or stuck down in the American history book, no one really had to know while it was happening. I was on the course to being a good high school student. I had already thought maybe I'd be a pre-med student, so I didn't want anything to alter this facade that I was a successful high school person. But finally, as a high school senior, I gave blood at my local high school blood drive, which apparently I'm not supposed to do. And later that day, I was walking down the hall at the end of the school day with my friends, and I felt another one of these things, which I called weirds because I felt weird, come. And even though the normal, typical weird would go and then abate in about 30 seconds, this one kept going until I feel like I tried to reach out to my friend and ask her for help, but then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the bed of an ambulance with a stranger's face hovering over me. He explained that I had a grand mal seizure when we were on the way to the hospital. The subsequent hospitalization and diagnostic testing led to my diagnosis of epilepsy. Again, I was placed on another new anti-epileptic medication, and I was sent home, and hopefully everything would get better. Right before I was diagnosed with epilepsy, I had been admitted to a program here at UW, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, called the Med Scholars Program. And they told me that if I maintained my grades in college here at UW, then I would be automatically admitted to the medical school. So with this new frightening diagnosis and my kind of career path already chosen, I made a really deliberate decision that I would never let seizures define me, and I would never let epilepsy alter my career goals. And again, kind of blissfully or luckily, things did get better. For the first several years at UW-Madison, I took my medicine every day, the seizures were gone, I met somebody that I kind of liked, and things were good. But then as my sleep deprivation increased, my stress level increased, slowly but surely, seizures marched their way back into my life. Soon enough, I was having a small cluster of seizures every month. So eventually I came to visit an adult neurologist here at UW. he was really kind. He listened to my story and listened closely. And before he offered anything, any additional treatment or suggestions, he sat back and he looked at me and he said, "Kristin, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I think you need surgery." And I was a senior in college at this time, and I didn't have time for seizures. I didn't have time for medicines. I sure as heck didn't have time for brain surgery. So I walked out of that office and respectfully agreed to start taking more medicine, but I wasn't going to go the surgery route to remove the scar that had formed so long ago. And again, the seizures went away for 4 years, which was wonderful. Those 4 years saw my attendance here at UW, marriage to Andrew, and the beginning of my pediatric residency at UW. I was a resident here before the work hour restrictions were passed, so we were working, laughter. We were working 100 hours a week, overnight into the next day, and then we'd go home at like 5 p.m. that day. For someone who's particularly susceptible to the effects of sleep deprivation, again, you can probably imagine my seizures marched back into my life. And at this point, I just wasn't willing to tolerate seizures at all. So I went back to my neurologist and I said, okay, let's try something different. And we began the long, ongoing, still ongoing process of what I like to call the medication roulette, where we try a new medicine, see if it works, see if I tolerated it, and then try something else if we needed to. Over the next several years, I tried 6 different medications. Some gave me side effects like double vision, some stopped working in a couple months, some worked for a while and then stopped. Finally, during the second year of my peds residency, after I had taken a new medicine and had double vision that day, I waved my white flag to epilepsy. I walked into the neurologist's office and I said, "I'm ready for that surgery." And 6 months later, I had the removal of my right temporal lobe and that scar that had formed so many years ago. And hopefully, I had walked seizures out of my life. After my right temporal lobectomy in 2003, I went back to work 4 weeks later. I felt awesome. Actually, I didn't feel awesome, but I was excited because I thought I had left seizures behind and I thought I was moving on and this was all just a thing of the past. 5 months later, the seizures came back. I didn't know it at the time, but I was pregnant with my son Alex, our first son, who miraculously, despite a pregnancy of seizures and medications, is perfect and wonderful. My life between 2003 and as I stand in front of you today has been kind of a sine wave of the same process. I have periods where seizures are better. I have periods where seizures are worse. I have new medications and not new medications. I sometimes feel like this isn't a part of our life at all, and sometimes it worries me every day. The other thing I realized, though, is if I ever mentioned to somebody that I had epilepsy, especially in the medical setting, they'd change the subject really fast, or they'd look somewhere else, or if I mentioned it to another mom or another doctor, they'd say, "Oh, but you take medicine, so you're fine, right?" And because of that discomfort, I also learned to stop talking about it. I was back to really hiding my symptoms because I didn't want to appear vulnerable, and I didn't want to appear as I was somebody who couldn't be your doctor or couldn't be your friend. Finally, before I delivered my daughter, our daughter, the day before I was sitting at my desk at Group Health, finishing up notes. I was scheduled to leave for maternity leave the next day. And one of the nurses I worked with came up to me, and she said, "Oh, Kristin, are you ready to meet the baby?" And I explained, yes, I was really ready for this pregnancy to be done. And then she paused, and she looked at me, and she goes, "Kristin, this pregnancy has been so easy for you. You know, everything goes so easily for you." What she didn't know is I had been to the ER twice, I had been on escalating doses of medicines, and I really felt terrible. As Laura walked away, I realized that maybe I'd kept this secret for too long. Maybe I was too good at hiding things. Maybe my silence was contributing to that stigma that still remains associated with epilepsy. So after Callie was born, I began to write. I wrote my story like I told you today, from the very beginning all the way through. What was interesting to me as I wrote is that I began to see my epilepsy in a different way. I came to a place of acceptance that this is my vulnerability, this is my Achilles heel, but we all have one. I also realized that talking about things made me feel a lot better about where I was headed and where I'd been. I also realized that the way my doctors had treated me really made a difference in my health care. When a doctor expressed empathy or did something really simple to make a difference in my day, it made a difference in how I felt about my health and how I felt about my healing. So this book was published in November of last year, almost a year ago. And in the past year, I've had a lot of pleasure in talking to groups about epilepsy, trying to raise awareness, talking to people that are living with epilepsy. I've talked to a internal medicine physician who's living with epilepsy, and who actually I was the first adult he had told about it because he was so afraid of what other people would think. I talked to a neurologist who has epilepsy, who was desperate for me not to share her name, to not know who she was, because she was so afraid of what people would think of her if they knew. I talked to a mother of a child who's devastated by her seizures. But all these conversations end in the same way. Although our stories are all different, our thoughts are the same. We're all hoping for that one thing, that one treatment that might lead eventually to a cure. So you guys have been so sweet and sat here and listened attentively, but you might be wondering, okay, epilepsy's common, it's a big deal, what can I do? First and foremost, I think actually talk about it. I had a pediatric neurologist who trained me who used to like to say, if somebody unfortunately has cancer, we don't say they have a cancer disorder. We say Peggy is affected by cancer. We don't have to call epilepsy a seizure disorder. If we avoid that word, we stigmatize it further. We dance around the real issue, and it's okay to talk about it. If you hear about epilepsy on the news, if you walk away from here today, turn to a neighbor or someone who doesn't know and said, hey, did you know 1 in 26 people have epilepsy? Did you know it's super common? And get involved. If you're so inclined, CURE stands for Citizens United in Research in Epilepsy. It was founded by 2 moms of children with really severe epilepsy. And this is the single largest non-governmental funder of epilepsy research across the nation. Remiss that I forgot it on this slide, but just as important is Lily's fund. Where are you? There you are. Who was also started by moms of children who live with epilepsy. And Lily's funds research at UW-Madison directly for epilepsy, given directly here at home. Lily's has a luau every year in January. These folks would be very happy to talk to you about it, and they're sitting right over there. The Epilepsy Foundation also, which Art Taggart is involved in, is a great organization that raises awareness about epilepsy, educates others about epilepsy, and helps those of us who are living with epilepsy. And what do you do if you actually find somebody having a seizure? What can you do to help them? Unless you're an EMT or you're carrying diazepam in your back pocket, there's nothing you're going to do to stop that seizure. So the thing that you can do is provide care and comfort to the patient. First and foremost, stay calm. I can tell you from personal experience, it's a little freaky if you wake up and you've been unconscious and everybody around you is panicking. If you can be calm, it's very, very helpful. You're not going to stop the muscle movements, but you can help prevent injury by moving any nearby objects out of the way. And pay attention to the length of the seizure. Most people won't intervene until a seizure lasts for 15 minutes or more. So by watching your clock, that's actually a really helpful piece of information. And again, please make that person having a seizure as comfortable as possible. If they were unconscious, if they wake up, don't ask them who they are, where they are, what the time of day is, and all that stuff. Just explain to them what has happened and tell them that help's on the way if necessary. You don't have to call EMS after every seizure, especially in a person that you know has epilepsy. But if you don't know a person has epilepsy, if they're pregnant, or frankly, if you're ever out of your comfort zone, call for help. It can only be helpful. Please do not hold the person down. The muscle movements, especially associated with the generalized seizure, are very, very strong. If you try to stop them, you risk injuring the patient. Please do not stick anything in their mouth. Who remembers when we used to tell people that? If you actually stick things in your mouth, you create more risk of choking and hazard. If you want to do something, you can turn the patient gently on their side in case they vomit, but you don't even have to do that. Before I read this summary slide, I've been encouraged to read you guys a poem that I wrote to describe what it's like to live with epilepsy. I was asked a couple years ago to talk to a group who are familiar with epilepsy about my experiences. This poem's in the book if you're so inclined to buy it, which you don't have to. The proceeds from book sales are going to the Madison Rotary Foundation. So this is about what it's like to live with epilepsy. Living with epilepsy means that I know the distinctive scent of EEG glue as well as I know the scent of my own children. Living with epilepsy means that I've learned how to fall asleep in MRI machines, wait patiently in doctor's offices, and perform neurologic tests without prompting. Living with epilepsy means that I must not be the epileptic patient, but rather the patient with epilepsy. I cannot let seizures own me. Living with epilepsy means that even some of my most significant days have been accompanied by seizures. The day I delivered my son, my 10th anniversary, Christmas Day, Thanksgiving. Living with epilepsy means that when familiar sensations of a partial seizure appear, I find myself searching for a place to sit, away from view in case the simple seizure leads to something more. Living with epilepsy means hiding my illness under a well-designed shroud, afraid that if others know I have seizures, they will lose their faith and trust in me. Living with epilepsy means I examine my tongue each morning in the mirror to look for the characteristic bite that is a sign of my nocturnal seizure. Living with epilepsy means learning to ignore the staggering fatigue that comes with each new medication trial and medication adjustment. Living with epilepsy means I can list almost every anti-seizure medication and its associated side effect profile. I have tried them all. Living with epilepsy means that I treasure the mundane and hold these things as close as possible for fear of losing them. My driver's license, health insurance, life insurance. Living with epilepsy means that I will consent to tests that turn off part of my brain, remain tethered to a wall with an extension cord for up to a week, and consent for removal of my entire temporal lobe in hopes for a cure that still eludes me. Living with epilepsy means I have created a handful of euphemisms to describe a seizure: head problem, not right, episode, incident. Living with epilepsy means I feel compelled to join others like me to look down the long, dark road that I pray may ultimately lead to a cure. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take questions.
Dr. Seaborg, thank you for being here today,
Sure, glad to be here.
and thanks for the courage to educate us on the problem of epilepsy.
Thank you.
My question is, I have a niece who's had lupus for about 40 plus years and continues to have seizures, not a lot, but frequently enough. So is the seizures in lupus and the seizures in epilepsy and other diseases, do they have a commonality to it, or are there differences depending on the disease?
That's a really, really good question. I imagine lupus is an autoimmune disease. There are types of epilepsy that are caused by autoimmune processes attacking the brain, so that's my best guess, the doctor guess. But it's not typically something that like they teach us in school, if a patient has lupus, worry about seizures. What they're finding as they do more and more research is that although epilepsy is a constellation of symptoms, it's probably caused by a wide variety of different genes. So your niece who's affected possibly has one gene that affects her brain in one way and her autoimmune system in another.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
When I was a young boy, I played tennis in the public courts, and there used to be a man who came around once in a while, and he watched us play tennis. One day he had an epilepsy, I think. He grabbed the tennis tee, and he had the strength to bend that it was really, and no person can do that.
Yeah.
But he did.
Yeah.
And we got so scared. We were all afraid. And, we'd known about put the pencil in the mouth and keep, But what do you do on a situation like that?
So exactly what I said on the slide. Our recommendations have changed in the past, I'm imagining 5 years since your nephew had that. Teasing. So what you would do if that happened to you today is you would gently, if he was unconscious, gently help him to the ground, make sure there's nothing sharp around him, and then watch your watch. And that's it. You don't need to do anything else. Yeah.
Do you have any estimate of how many people with epilepsy are able to lead very successful lives as you have compared to ones that are truly disabled, if you will?
I wish
you
I
said
did.
there are different stages.
Spectrum.
Yeah.
You know what? I wish I did. What I can tell you is that there are certain types of epilepsy that are more associated with people that are able to function. I'm lucky. Temporal lobe epilepsy, which is what I have, is more often associated with ability to have a life with a lot of things.
The question back here.
Also,
First choice.
sometimes the more seizures you have as a young child, that affects your developing brain as opposed to as an older adult. Things are different. So sorry, that's kind of an answer, but not a full answer.
Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to really compliment you on sharing your path of discovery from not disclosing to all the way to talking with us. And I wonder, given that we're talking about 1 in 26, if you might share some thoughts about how you found it best to disclose, and then what responses you have found most beneficial that might help us all respond to people who choose to share with us.
Sure. So my how to disclose is probably not really practical, because what I did is wrote it all in a book and published it. And then there was just no question whatsoever. But if you're talking about an employer or a family member or somebody that you want to be careful, I feel like this is pediatrics. Honesty is the best policy. Hey, I live with seizures. I take medicines every day. If you happen to witness a seizure, here's what you can do. If a family member, I was asked this before, if a family member approaches you and says that, like, hey, I have epilepsy, the best thing you can do for that family member is to have an open mind and an open heart and listen. What was so therapeutic for me was actually being able to share this story with you guys and with so many others, because hiding it for 20 years really, builds up and becomes more of a burden than it is, a helpful thing. Does that help at all? Yeah.
I also wanted to commend you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
And I was reminded of my mother-in-law, who was a teacher, and her fear of being exposed to having epilepsy. It was just incredible. So this is a wonderful story. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been told that was the last question. But I'll be out there, and we have books. Don't feel like you have to buy them, but I'd be happy to talk to anybody, too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seaborg, for your wonderful story. This meeting is adjourned.